if you're a white person, listen up. This whole episode is mostly for you. Why? Hang out, we'll talk about it with Daniel Hill on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
That's the name of the program, and we're so glad you're here. I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. We're going to talk about being white today, and for the first time, we have an expert panel. You know, we're experts on being white, but maybe not. We'll talk about it. In our defense, we also don't have any women here either. Our resident mega church pastor, Zach Van Dyke, is here. Zach, I know your name. It just takes a while.
We've only been doing this
That's
10
not the name
years.
I thought would throw us.
I'm old, okay? Zach is still excited that he can now ask, have you heard the new Kanye West album?
Yeah, my whole family, we listen to it all the time. But I was listening to Kanye West.
You were
before,
ahead of the curve.
I'm not like the bandwagon Kanye West guy. So.
All right.
Well, I didn't listen to him before, and I'm not listening to him now.
Okay.
But I pray for him daily because I believe God's doing something with that thing.
Definitely.
In a major way. Matthew, of course, Porter, is with us. By the way, look for Matthew's new autobiography. It's titled Born on Third Base. One middle-class white guy's brave struggle to make his already charmed life just a little more awesome.
I have to speak my truth.
And our producer, Jinx, is working hard in the little glass booth. Jinx mutes out all the cussing and the coughing. So if we ever suddenly go quiet, you'll know why.
Yeah, this is actually a 2-hour program.
Yeah, that's true. Our video director, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. John is actually an expert at creating elaborate Christian light displays. Then he comes in and gets to work with a bunch of dim bulbs.
I resemble that remark.
And then Dr. George Bingham is here. He's the president of Key Life. George wants to remind you it's easy to get out of any awkward conversation at Thanksgiving. Simply say, excuse me, I have to go make a tax-deductible donation to Key Life Network.
And we will be thankful.
I bet that would work.
Listen, this is going to be an interesting program. We've all been talking about this book, and I spent the weekend reading every word of it, at the end of which I said, but of course, you know, I'm a lot worse than he thinks, and so is everybody else that I know. So we kind of start, when you start with grace, that we're already screwed up. And not a little bit. The results of the fall are pretty big, but we're going to get into that as we talk to our guest. And our guest is Daniel Hill. He's the founding and senior pastor of River City Community Church. It's a vibrant, multi-ethnic church in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. He's the author of 1010, Life to the Fullest. And his new book, I just thought of a smart comment, but I'm not going to make it because I'm a nice person. And, you could retitle that. I can help you with the title on the first book. I just want you to know, Daniel. And then the book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is titled White Awake. An honest look at what it means to be white. Daniel, we appreciate you taking your time to be with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Hey, listen. Yes, it is. You're very fortunate. we're
You're
white.
talking to the most humble man on the planet.
Just ask him.
Daniel, we can start in a lot of different places, but I want to start kind of where you started. The concern for race, reconciliation, really Christians being aware of who they are and where they've been, especially white Christians, is not a new thing for you. I mean, it's been kind of a part of what you defined, the way you defined yourself early on. But it didn't start very well, did it? You want to tell us that story?
Are you talking about kind of the wedding story where I first heard that for the first time?
Well, when you decided you're going to have a ministry and you called your 3 or 4 friends and they weren't that nice to you, frankly.
Yeah. So there's kind of, I feel like there's different parts of the journey that are important. There's like kind of when we first come in contact with the reality of race, and that's its own kind of thing. Yeah. And then for some of us, once we become a little bit aware of it, we try to find ways to make a difference and do something helpful or positive. And so I was working at a large white megachurch at the time and really wanted to try to create a culture diverse ministry. And so I was kind of given the blessing to start something in downtown Chicago. And so that was a big focus of what we were trying to do, was pursue cultural diversity. And so one of the black pastors in the city asked if I wanted to meet with some of the gatekeeper folks in the city to kind of share my vision. He kind of got me in contact with a key black pastor, key Puerto Rican pastor, key Asian American pastor, key white pastor, and had me share my vision, which I think I imagined that at the end of it, they would say, "Wow, we've been waiting for you." That's not what happened. When I shared it, they all kind of looked, made that furrowed, face, trying to figure out what they wanted to say. And so the Latino pastor went first and said, "You seem like you've got good intentions, but everything you say is so paternalistic. I have trouble hearing it." Didn't even know paternalistic meant at that point. So I thought maybe it was a compliment, but his
Thank you.
his perception did not. So Asian American pastor went second and said, "You're talking about being a culturally diverse church, but everything I just heard you say was kind of in a context of exclusively black and white. And do you even know Asian American people? Do you know how many different stories there are? Like, what kind of homework have you done around that?" The white pastor was kind of very straightforward as well. He said, "If I had $1 for every white person who thought they were going to save the city of Chicago, I'd be a rich man. Everything's still here in 5 years. I'll be amazed." And then the black pastor actually said, you got to understand the race stuff goes deep in Chicago. So even if you did figure some stuff out, it's unlikely black folks are ever going to go to a church led by a white pastor in a city like Chicago. So you'd save yourself some trouble if you just kind of cut bait on this now. And so it was a real kind of come to Jesus moment for me of really figuring out what it was I was trying to do, what this had to do with him, what my role was within it. And it was kind of my dark night of the soul.
I would have walked. I'd have come back to the suburbs and my swimming pool and my nice car. And, you were working for a very wealthy church. You could have gotten more money and taken the advice of the 4 pastors who were honest with you. But evidently, somebody had you by the short hairs.
Right.
You want to talk about that, your passion?
Yeah,
I mean, why did you go back? I mean, okay, let me put it in the form of a question. You get that kind of response from the people you're trying to help. Frankly, because it's me, I would have made an obscene gesture and say, "All right, you don't need me, man, I'm out of here." You didn't, and in fact, are passionate. Where did that come from? And why did you listen to what they say and begin a fairly long journey to discover some things about yourself and your ministry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think different things kind of create the igniting force for different ones of us. I mean, for me, it's going to sound so churchy, but it really is my faith in Jesus that's been the driving reality. I spent a lot of my years in a very lukewarm place, but once I really gave my life fully to Christ in my early 20s, that's been the driving force of my life, is trying to follow Jesus and understand what it means to seek him in his kingdom. And so I still didn't even have full words for it when that story happened that we just talked about. But what was happening was a faith shift for me, where I was coming to see the construct of race, not just as some kind of isolated, unique thing that some people should be aware of. I was really coming to a point of seeing it as kind of a principality or stronghold that was really positioned in direct opposition to Jesus Christ and his kingdom. And really, I've come to a conviction since is probably the primary stronghold, the principality that's kind of positioned against Jesus and his kingdom. And so I was coming to a pretty deep conviction, excuse me, that it's basically impossible to follow Jesus in this day and age without understanding the deep grip of the construct of race and the way it affects us individually on an everyday basis, the way it affects the systems and structures of our society. Excuse me. And so,
son, you got to quit smoking. You just have to give it up.
You need to share your.
If you love Jesus, you'd quit. That's what they tell me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
See, I understand why you don't have the cough, and I do. That's what I'm trying to some venturing to do here. What that conversation showed me was not so much, hey, I'm here to help you and you're ungrateful for it. What it showed me is that I still don't see most of what I need to see. And they're just being truth tellers to me that, like, you're stumbling into something that's way bigger than you. And if you really want to do this, there's a whole lot more you need to see and understand before you ever try to step into this world. And so Daniel, I wanted to see it.
End it right there. We'll talk about that and get specific on the other side of the break. The name of the book is White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. Guys, we got to pay for this, so we're going to rest up and, like Jesus, return. Brown, etc. And we're so glad you're here. We're talking with Daniel Hill and his book, which was designed to make you feel uncomfortable and to make you think and to repent and be born again and to make a difference. And the title of the book, you'll read it and you'll be uncomfortable. And if you're not, you either know how bad you are or you're being faced with some stuff that you need to hear. Thus endeth the sermon. The name of the book, by the way, is White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white.
Hey, Daniel, so question for you. It's the title is perfectly provocative. I really love it. And it was jarring because I rarely, if ever, am addressed by my race. You're like, oh, yeah, wait, yeah, I am white. I just never think of myself as white. And that's how you kind of get into the book a little bit, is the idea of cultural identity and that race is kind of a social construct. Is the concept that somebody doesn't, like me, doesn't perceive their race on a regular basis, is that part of the problem? How does identity figure into all of this?
Yeah, well, there's some groundwork that has to be laid that I think if we've not ever consciously thought about this stuff, it tends to be unfamiliar. It certainly was for me when I started trying to understand this. And so if I kind of started from kind of I'm coming at this as a pastor, so all right to kind of come at this from a biblical perspective a little bit. But when I started trying to understand race, the thing that people kept telling me is that race is a social construct and that you won't understand it until you understand that. And that felt really, if I'm honest, it felt offensive to me because my starting point was, no, the human race is created by God. Like, God is the author of life, not this social kind of thing. And what I didn't realize is they were describing something different than what we're thinking about, I think, when we talk about God creating life. And so what I do now, I tend to kind of try to create kind of clear delineation in terms between ethnicity and between race and try to show how different those two are. And so ethnicity, I think, would describe kind of our nationality, our background. It would describe kind of who we've kind of come to be. I would say that's a reflection of God's design of who we are. And there have always been different ethnicities, different nationalities. The Bible uses that word a lot. It talks about, going to all the nations, going to all the ethnics. So I think there's a sense of kind of understanding your ethnic or national heritage. That's one important source of this conversation, period. So that's one category. I don't think the term ethnicity or nationality should ever be used in the same conversation as race, because it creates confusion. So when people are using the term race, they're really describing a social convention that really most people would say is probably only 400 or 500 years old. So relatively speaking, it's very young compared to kind of how long human beings have been around. And it's really diabolical in every way. Everything about it, it's not even like a mixed thing where you can kind of take the good from the bad. It was diabolic from its very beginning, and it was a way of categorizing human beings, really kind of coming out of the necessity to explain some of the atrocities happening, explaining colonization around the world, that it was almost always European groups who were colonizing, non-European, darker skinned groups, often indigenous groups. And then really, especially most race scholars would say it was slavery that solidified the system of race. And to make a narrative that made sense of slavery, that all these different European people who weren't called white then, right? The category white was not part of the founding of America. It was Irish and English and Italians and Dutch and Polish, right? Like nobody thought of a category of white. Just in the same way, you didn't think of a category of Native American Indian, or you didn't think of a category of Black, right? There was all these different African tribes that were brought over. But these categories started to be created to make sense of how the world was shaping out. And so white began to become a category to describe all people of European descent. Black became a category to describe people all of African descent. And even the categories themselves are not what's most problematic, but all race scholars would agree that the system of race is built on a hierarchy. And so it's not viewing human differences as equivalent differences. It's whiteness was kind of described as the epitome of everything that's most human, that which is most desirable, that's most intelligent, that's most valuable. Blackness was from the very beginning kind of the system of race was described as that which is most inferior. So it's like literally the messaging behind race is that Black people are fundamentally inferior as human beings to white people. And so that developed over a long period of time. And then as other different immigrants started to come into the United States, especially because that's really the framework I'm talking about it in, they were kind of found, their value, their meaning was kind of found on this hierarchy with white at the top and Black at the bottom. And, they would get kind of slotted in somewhere along the way. And so we would take these perceived physical differences, create categories off of them, assign meaning based on hierarchy. And that's what really makes it a deeply spiritual issue, because Christians believe that human value comes from being created in the image of God, but race believes that human value and potential comes from where you fall on the racial hierarchy.
So is it literally it's a construct to mentally be able to kind of reconcile the idea of seeing this group of people as an other?
Yeah. Well, not even just other, because other doesn't necessarily mean value, right? Like in any situation, there's going to be one group that's kind of more comfortable and another group that's other. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're assigning value to their humanity. Race fundamentally assigns value to people's humanity based on where they fall on the hierarchy, which is a whole nother level beyond just other.
Daniel, you're actually, I'm very excited to have you on, because I read your book a couple weeks ago and told Steve about it, and so I was so excited that we got you on because it was very disruptive to me. It was very helpful. I'm part of a church that is primarily white, but we have over the last few years felt a real strong conviction about moving towards a church that looks a lot more like our city as far as multi-ethnic, looking more multi-ethnic like our city does. And so we've been doing all this reading and stuff, and your book was one of the books I read. One of the things that really stood out to me, though, was at the very first story, which I thought you were going to maybe tell in the first segment, about coming face to face with the fact that you have culture when you were at the wedding. And I think for us white guys, I think that's a very helpful story. So could you tell that story?
No, you can't. And that's not because it's not a good story. It's a good one.
I took too long to ask the question.
No. I waited too long to open it. We're too close to
Now it's a teaser.
Okay.
It's a teaser. Daniel, you need to know that all of our breaks are hard breaks. We have no wiggle room.
It's because I'm mean.
When the music starts, it means we're going to land the plane for that segment. And if I don't do that, then they just cut off the microphones and bring it to an end. And yes, Zach, your question was way too long. It went on and on and
Well, I'm
on.
a pastor. I can't help it, you know?
I think it's part of your culture.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Listen, guys, we're talking with Daniel Hill, and this is an uncomfortable book. I personally think it's a lot worse than Daniel thinks, but I'm a cynical preacher, and I can't help it. But we'll come back and pursue what Zach said. That's an important question, and one that we'll get some answers to on the other side of the break. The book, Wide Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. And you can download this interview at our website. That's keylife.org. And then play it for some of the leaders in your church. Then get down, study, and then party. Hey, we're so glad you're with us. Our guest is Daniel Hill, and his book is White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. And by the way, you can get more from Daniel at PastorDanielHill.com, and you can follow him on Twitter, Daniel Hill 1336.
All right, Daniel. So on the other side of the break, I was asking you about just becoming aware of our culture, and my church we're really trying to move to be a little bit more of a multi-ethnic expression of the church. And the other day, I was having coffee with an African American lady who goes to our church, and we were talking through some of this, and we had just done a women's retreat where we set up a display in the lobby for the women's retreat. And she said, when I walked in and saw that display, I said, oh, what a nice white woman's living room. And I had never even thought about that. I never even thought the fact that, like, how we set that up communicated something about race and culture. And so I thought your story of coming face to face with the fact that you have culture is really helpful. So could you tell that one?
About the wedding.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of where this all started for me. I was 24 years old, young minister, working at this kind of large suburban megachurch, and I think it was my third ever wedding, but it was the first cross-cultural wedding. It was a white woman and a man who was a son of Indian immigrant parents from India, and so as I got ready to, we were getting ready for the wedding, and he said, Dan, you're going to get a deep dive into Indian culture this weekend, and especially at the rehearsal dinner the night before. And so it was kind of steeped in Indian tradition. And so everything about it, the dancing, the music, the sounds, it all brought me into a culture I'd never seen before. And it was a very kind of almost magical experience. And so I grabbed him afterwards and I said, man, thank you for sharing that with me. I'm really jealous of you, actually. Like, nights like this really remind me that I don't have a culture and that I wish I did, so I could have stuff like this. And he tended to be a gregarious guy who didn't often go to deep subject matters, especially I wasn't expecting this on the night before his wedding, but he got very serious in that moment. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, Daniel, you have a culture. And not only do you have a culture, but when your culture comes in contact with other cultures, yours always wins. One of the best wedding gifts you could give me would be to start learning about your own culture.
Whoa.
And disappeared back off onto the dance floor and kind of left me like stunned, kind of deciding what to do with that. And that ended up being the thing, like that got in my head. I was very defensive actually about it at first, but it was kind of what continued to kind of require of me to kind of continue to explore that and try to understand what he was getting at.
Why do you think it is that that we're so shocked by? I mean, I feel like everyone I've told that story to, or like telling the story about the woman walking in and seeing the living room set up and saying it's a white living room. Like, why do you think we as white people are always so shocked? Like, I don't know anyone who just naturally knows they have culture like that. I feel like, and that's kind of what you were saying too, Matt, at the last segment about not realizing that you're white.
That's a nice living room.
Right. Why is it that it's so shocking to us?
Well, there's a simpler, easier to digest answer, and then there's a deeper, harder to digest answer. They're both real, but they come in at different levels. The easier simpler to digest one. I mean, I think you probably can make a case that any dominant culture anywhere kind of, so if you're living in Japan and there's kind of a way of doing things, right? Those who kind of swim in the culture of the majority dominant culture are probably going to be less aware of those who are different than them. And there will be things that they just kind of think as quote unquote normal that are actually totally cultural, not normal. And you don't really realize how normal those are until you see something different, right? This happens in marriage all the time, right? Like one spouse thinks there's a normal way to do things, then all of a sudden they get married and realize, oh, wow, that maybe is not only not normal, might be dysfunctional even, right? I mean, there's something about coming in contact with others that helps you realize that what you call normal is actually typically conditioned by your experience. So I think that's the probably easier to understand one, and definitely real. White culture is the norm in the United States of America. And so this is where you've grown up. As a white person, you've been in the dominant majority culture. You've never had to consider until you've opportunities like I had, where you're at a wedding where all of a sudden that's so different than what your normal is. The harder in probably eventually more important one to interact with is, we talked a little bit about the construct of race earlier on, and that at the heart of the construct of race is not just seeing difference, but seeing human value attached to those differences. Say more specifically, superiority associated with whiteness, inferiority associated with blackness. And so when you start to realize how deep race goes, you realize that there's messaging around it, there's narratives around it that constantly apply superior values to anything that feels white and inferior values to anything that feels black. And then again, there's kind of shades of that in between. And so there's a superiority kind of attached to things that are white. And we even see this oftentimes in missionaries or something like that. People go there's just kind of this expectation that white American Christianity is kind of the apex, of all the different Christian experiences. And so there's a kind of a deeper kind of reality in it that's really pretty unsettling if this is a newer conversation. But I don't feel like I would be telling the full story to say just the kind of normalness of the dominant culture. That's probably not the full. I think it's the messaging around race as well.
Whoa. All right.
Well, we fixed that right before the commercial.
Yeah, that is the heart of it. That's what we have to go after.
Of course, we got a problem of a meta-narrative, which would be the Christian one. So, and we have been given this thing about sharing that with others. That's because we believe it's better. The mix gets when you put white with it. And we've done a lot of that, and we're going to talk about it on the other side of the break.
Right.
Don't go anywhere. The name of the program is Steve Brown, etc. Our guest is Daniel Hill, and his book is White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. We obviously, in an hour, can't deal with some of the themes, and some of them are really, really heavy. This is not a comfortable book, but it's probably a necessary one. I'm so conservative. I've told you I think Rush Limbaugh's a communist. So I hate that idea of woke and all that. That drives me nuts. But maybe it's appropriate at this point.
Daniel, one of the things, especially with our organization, focus so much on grace, the idea of self-righteousness becomes an important one. You wrote a chapter on that. Can you talk about that in this context?
Yeah, I probably got to take a step back to answer that. So I think one of the there's a lot of things that kind of undercut positive movement on this stuff. One of them, I think we have way too narrow a definition of racism in most white circles. You ask the typical white Christian what racism is, and they would essentially answer it that it's when a bad person does a bad thing to a person of color. So there's the extreme versions of that we'd see with somebody who's outrightly white supremacist or something like that and harming people, to the just kind of everyday ways where discrimination happens in the workplace or somebody calls somebody a bad name or something. But that's kind of typically how we think of the impact of race, is when somebody who's white does something bad. I'm certainly not an advocate for people doing bad things. That's not the point of what I'm about to say. But based on our earlier conversations, I don't think that gets to the heart of what race is. I think what gets to the heart of race is this lie, this set of lies around human value that's attached to the hierarchy of race. And I think the lies are profound. And I think the Bible has a lot to say about lies. I think lies trace all the way back to the presence of the evil one, right? In John 8, Jesus calls the devil a liar, that he's the father of lies, native tongue is that of lies. And so I think to be impacted by race is not to measure behavior as much as it is to measure the ways in which the lie has impacted us. And that's where I do see a connection back to how the Bible talks about grace. And Steve started this at the beginning of the show too, right? That we don't come to God and saying, I did some good and some bad, and I promise to do all good from now this point forward. And that's what the conversion is. It's saying, even in my best moments, I'm dominated by sin, right? I'm dominated by bad motivations and self-righteousness, doing things for my own. So even my best is going to fall short. So I don't come convincing Jesus of my good deeds. I come admitting that I'm a sinner. And I think the way out of race, I think there's a self-righteous way where we say, what do the good white people do? And let me make sure I fall in that good white people category, which even if we don't say quite that straightforwardly, that's how a lot of us deal with it. It's a very Pharisaical way, right? Like, thank God I'm not like the tax collectors and the prostitutes. It's, in this case, it's like, thank God I'm not like the bad white people who do whatever, X, Y, Z. And I don't think that's the way out. I think the way out is realizing that the lies behind this are super deep, super infectious, touch everything, including us, on a daily basis. And we have to ask kind of Jesus to attend to the depth level of those lies, much more so than trying to monitor our behaviors.
Do you, it seems to me that a part of this, one of the reasons I'm such good friends, and he's such a good friend of mine, and vice versa, of the black pastor at the church where I preached this time, is because we both of us start with the statement you just made. That's not, the fall does not stop outside the door of white Pharisees. It doesn't stop outside the door of black Pharisees or Puerto Ricans or whatever, because it's universal. And if you don't get that, you can't move. And I think you, in effect, said that in your chapter on self-righteousness. The thing I did, and I want you to do one other thing before we go. We've got 2 or 3 more minutes. I loved a couple of things about you. Your effort to avoid that self-righteous, I've got this thing down, and I'm going to show you poor benighted whites how you can get it down the way I do. I never heard that in your book. But I'm intrigued, and I want to go there because it's so basic. When you went to John 3 and talked about being born again, you kind of shattered my evangelical born-again theology. Would you tell us how you see being born again?
And I'm not trying to fully shatter. I do think at its most basic level, being born again is speaking to regeneration, to conversion, that we're leaving kind of the world of sin and entering into the world of righteousness with Jesus. So I'm not challenging any of those traditional interpretations of it. I just think it's interesting. You've got the most religious of the most religious who's asking about that, right? That's the context matters. That's the only time Jesus talks about being born again, right? Is in John 3 with Nicodemus. So you have the most well-behaved, most religiously devoted person you could possibly have.
That would be me.
So Jesus doesn't say, now just be a little bit more devoted or a little bit more religious. He actually says you literally have to be reborn, right? And he links it to no one can see the kingdom of God without being born again. And so one of the really important applications for me about that is that God's kingdom touches everything, right? And that an important part of learning to follow Jesus is to see his kingdom. And I would say by proxy to see the kingdom of this world, right? The kind of 3 times in the book of John, Jesus calls the devil the kind of prince of this world, right? He's got a kingdom here that is being unseated by Jesus and his kingdom. And so I think that's a starting point for me, is that religious devotion is not the same thing as seeing the world around me. The religious devotion is important. It's just not the same thing as seeing. And that being born again includes this constant process of trusting that Jesus is trying to reveal things to me that I've not seen. And I would say the kingdom of grace is one of the most important things that we have to move from blindness to sight on.
You, as you speak these truths, or do you expect something supernatural to happen? Do you expect that that really people who have been born again because the Spirit of God is in them will connect with what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of quickly referenced John 8 earlier, but in John 8, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, he talks about the devil being a liar, the father of lies. But what he says to the Pharisees is, right now you belong to your father, which I think is a terrifying reality, that you can know Scripture really well, be really religiously devoted, and still be aligned with lies. And so I think there is an overall alignment with the lies that race continues to promote. And I think that the next big spiritual renewal we have in our country is going to have to include seeing the depth level of those lies and choosing not to align with them any longer in ways that we probably didn't realize we were. But I think that that's what will be a big part of our confession and repentance, is realizing that we inadvertently still were on the side of lies more often than on the side of truth when it comes to this particular arena.
By the way, you ought to get with our time's up, and I hate it. I wish we could talk to you for 2 or 3 more hours.
Yeah, me too.
But what Daniel's saying in this book is really important. It's really important, and if you feel uncomfortable with it, you're uncomfortable with grace. The one thing that knowing that you're loved and accepted because of Christ's righteousness means you don't have to defend anything anymore. You can say, but of course. Daniel, I know this was a hard book to write. I appreciate your writing it, and I appreciate your time from a busy pastor's schedule to spend the time with us. Hope we can do it again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for hosting me. It was great.
The name of the book, once again, is by Daniel Hill, White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. You'll be surprised, but if you're a real Christian, you'll say, but of course. Don't go away. Good time with Daniel. He's got some profound things to say. One of the questions I wanted to ask and didn't get to, if we'd had more time, I would have, was if a conservative could have a place at his table. Actually, I don't think this is a conservative liberal discussion. It really isn't. I suspect that Daniel and I don't share the same political views, but maybe we do. I don't know. That didn't come up. But I kid about being a conservative. I really am. This whole white supremacy thing and being woke, I hate identity politics. It's driving me nuts, and it's destroying our country. I feel that some social media is a sewer, and that the hatred is unbelievable. But listen. This is something that has nothing to do with all of that. It's simply a recognition of a reality and a repentance of some places we've been. It's a repentance that everybody has to go through because we've all done bad. We all are great sinners in need of a great Savior. And this is just one area, and it's an area worth discussing. And I'm glad we did. If you get the book, maybe like me, you'll throw it across your office 2 or 3 times before you say to Jesus, all right, I'll read it. And you go get it and you bring it back, and all of a sudden it begins to click. You know, this guy's got some important things to say. So get it and do that. Kathy, by the way, is in Maine, in the snow and ice and cold, which she loves. So you're going to have to play, Matthew, Kathy's, can you raise your voice and be a little bit more feminine than you usually are?
I don't think anybody wants that.
And let's see how you do it making cupcakes. Right?
Yeah, we're rapidly exiting my wheelhouse. I will plug next week's show. We have Andrew J. Ballman. He is a licensed mental health counselor. He wrote a book called Stumbling Toward Wholeness, How the Love of God Changes Us. And it is exploring the story of the prodigal son. And he says sometimes we're the prodigal son, sometimes we are the bitter older brother. That's me. And he says if we are brave enough, we can sometimes even find ourselves living and loving in the same way as the Father. Okay, if you say so.
Be good. He's a good friend of Dan Allender's, who's our friend, and any friend of Dan's is a friend of ours. I just got a bunch of enemies for saying that. I shouldn't have even. So it's time to go. But we're coming back next week, same time, same place. Hope you can join us. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.